Hello again, everyone. I'm Travis Martin. I'm going to do a quick whiteboarding session for you. I like to call this one Containers for the C-Suite. I do this a lot for my high school classes, juniors and seniors. They seem to get a lot out of it and goes really fast. Basically, it'll take you from a zero to container, at least literate, in a couple of minutes, right? So I drew a little bit on the whiteboard here in advance so I didn't have to draw it all out and take too much time. On the bottom, I got a legend. So we're going to draw triangles for apps. We're going to draw a circle for the OSs, and we're going to draw a red square for any of their dependencies like tables, log files, stuff like that. Okay, let's go to where it started. On this side over here, I wrote MF on there, and that does not mean what you think it does. That's where I started on, which was a mainframe type solution, right? So you had an OS, and inside of the OS, you had the apps and dependencies on typically one system, and then they would farm that out to all the rest of the clients in the field, okay? Speed up a little bit. Next on the list, we went to having an OS on a single host like that, right? With, again, the apps and dependencies inside of here. Excuse my boxes, everybody. And then your dependencies being triangles, right? Or their apps, sorry, being triangles, right? All these were on one OS, and then we'd replicate this across multiple hosts. You'd have several hosts. You might have one host doing SQL, right? And you might have one host doing Exchange at the time, before it was hosted remotely, okay? And then around 2001, fast forward a little further, and a couple of technologies came out. So VMware released their first VM in 2001. And that allowed us to do stuff like put an OS on a system, right? OS on a system, still with their dependencies and apps built in. So I'm gonna draw them right over top of this here. Triangles and dependencies built in. Okay, so I've still got my apps on there and my dependencies for the apps. All the data tables, all the log files, all that are all still in the same package on these systems. Now, the benefit that VMware brought to the table, and I'll tell you about Virtuoso in a minute, is that they allowed you to do a couple of things with it. You could remotely host your data on a storage array. So this is a SAN, storage area network of some sorts in the back, making these redundant, right? So if one of these servers fails, the data is on a separate device and it fails over to other VM hosts in the system. It's really cool. Makes it where you're highly available all the time, right? You could also do, they built out systems called hyperscale or hyper-converged solutions. And on a hyper-converged solution like Nutanix or vSAN or SimpliVity if you're an HPE fan, they allow you to scale this without the SAN using just the storage in the host and replicating the data. So this might be copy one, and this would be copy one over here, and this would be number two, and this would be a copy of number two over here. So it allows you to replicate the data across the host in the cluster of servers using the storage internal to the servers and do the same thing, okay? Now, while they were doing this between 2001 and the present, what we'll call this present, okay? While this was going on, Virtuoso made container technology in that same year, 2001, released it to mostly service providers. And then a few years later, Docker partnered with them and they wrote some things for Docker. And that's what most people know today as Docker, Kubernetes, K8 containers, right? So the way a container works is we take our OSs, okay, and we stripe an OS, typically Linux-based, all right, across the base of each server, okay? All right, now what this does for you is, this allows you to now, in the background, via command scripts, okay, you can take your dependencies and your apps, and they're treated independently, okay, and your apps, all right, and we can link these through the OS to each other, all right? Now what this gives us is the ability to add a lot more containers because we don't have the OS tax. So a bake-off was done while I was at Virtuoso from a large service provider. And they had a rack full of VMware hosts and a rack full of containers running Virtuoso at the time. And they had this set up like this, where they only had one OS on each box and all the apps and dependencies are pointed at that one OS. So what it does is over here on this scenario, each one of these virtual machines I was talking about, those have an OS on them, a Windows OS typically or Linux OS, and there's a tax for that. Especially when you have 60, 100 of them on a single system, then you really get a lot of overhead from those OSs. Well, what the hosting provider found out was they could run a third more users running containers on the same cluster of hosts, same one rack of servers as they could on VMware, on VMs, traditional VMs, just by stripping off those OSs. They're much more lightweight, they're easy to deploy, they're quick. Again, by meshing them in the background on the OS, you can link different apps together with different tables. It's pretty cool technology. So as you start building this out, it gets messy fast. Most people build this like a Lego project, meaning that you literally are taking pieces from GitHub and putting it together and making your containers in K8s and spinning them up, and some people even do that in production. But at some point, you're gonna get a bunch of these floating around there, and you're gonna need some orchestration layer, right? And that's where like Docker will come in, or OpenShift is a really good one. Tanzu is another one from VMware if you guys are VMware shops. You'll need something to orchestrate and to mitigate all of the updates and patches and just the day-to-day operations you have on this type of solution. So that, again, that's where I would bring in like a Tanzu or a third-party solution. OpenShift, I give a really good class on OpenShift. I'll do one of those also. But this is how containers work and where they came from. The apps and dependencies are independent of the OS, and the OS is striped across the whole host. So you only have one OS on the containerized host. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoy the content. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'll be posting a lot of these throughout the next couple weeks. Have a good day.